question is, Indian Supreme Court, through its power of interpretation, reduced the powers of Union Executive as well as Legislature vis-a-vis Judiciary. Critically examine. So, Judiciary versus Union Legislature. The case which you have to quote is Keshavananda Bharati versus State of Kerala, 24th April 1973. So before 24th April 1973, there was no doctrine of basic structure. It was a judicial creation. It was an innovation made by the Indian Supreme Court in Keshavananda Bharati case. So before Keshavananda Bharati case, before 24th April 1973, the power of Indian Parliament to amend the Constitution under Article 368 is unlimited. It can amend any provision of the Indian Constitution. It can rewrite the Indian Constitution under Article 368. But in Keshavananda Bharati versus State of Kerala, the Supreme Court has coined a doctrine called Doctrine of Basic Structure. So there are certain features in the Indian Constitution which are very basic, very essential, very fundamental, which are beyond the power of the Parliament to amend. Which are beyond the power of the Parliament to amend. So this is one judgment. So in which the Supreme Court has cut down the powers of the Parliament. Unlimited amending power was converted into a limited amending power. Remember, doctrine of basic structure, it was not even there in the minds of the framers of the Indian Constitution. If you closely read the Constituent Assembly debates, never ever the framers of the Indian Constitution have entertained this idea of doctrine of basic structure. It was not even there in their minds. But it was the Supreme Court which has coined this doctrine of basic structure. Is there a reason for that? Some say that it is extra constitutional. See, if you coin a term doctrine of basic structure, that means you are introducing a new term into the Indian Constitution. That amounts to the amendment. Who has the power to amend the Constitution? Parliament has the power to amend the Constitution. But Indian Supreme Court, through its power of interpretation, is also doing amendments. Coining the term doctrine of basic structure, it is a kind of amendment to the Constitution of India, and the Indian Supreme Court doesn't have the power of amendment. It can only interpret the provisions. So people call that doctrine of basic structure is a kind of amendment to the Indian Constitution, and such a power is there only with the Parliament. Such a power is not there for the Supreme Court of India. So the power of interpretation was used by the Indian Supreme Court to amend the Constitution of India, and this is extra constitutional. This is not fair on the judgment of the Supreme. This is not fair on the part of the Indian Supreme Court to take powers which are not envisaged for it by the framers of the Indian Constitution. But why the Supreme Court did so? There was a reason. There are compelling reasons for the Supreme Court to do so. Why? The reasons are, when Mrs. Indira Gandhi was the Prime Minister, she had a brute majority both in Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha. She took up several constitutional amendment acts which are arbitrary. For example, one amendment which was done by the Indira Gandhi government said that the election of the Prime Minister, Speaker cannot be challenged before the Supreme Court and High Courts. So this amendment took away the power of the judicial review of these higher courts to look into the disputes relating to the election of Prime Minister and Speaker. So this was done by Mrs. Indira Gandhi to save her position. Election of Mrs. Indira Gandhi was invalidated by the Allahabad High Court. So she was going to lose her prime ministerialship. So she wanted to protect herself by making an amendment to secure her position. So doctrine of basic structure has both merits and demerits. What is the merit? The Supreme Court can control arbitrary amendments. The amendments which are not in the larger public interest, which go against undermining the Constitution of India, can be struck down by invoking the doctrine of basic structure. For example, recently in 2015, we had this case, NJAC case, National Judicial Appointments case. This is also called fourth judge case. Supreme Court Advocates and Record Association versus Union of India are also called the fourth judge case. In this case, Indian Supreme Court has struck down the 99th Constitutional Amendment Act, which has provided for the establishment of NJAC. What is the ground? It affects the independence of judiciary. In the NJAC, there is no primacy to the judiciary. NJAC contained 6 members, 1 Chief Justice of India and 2 senior most judges. So they constitute 3 out of 6. That is not a majority. So they don't have primacy. If the judiciary doesn't have primacy in the NJAC, that will in course of time undermine the independence of judiciary. So NJAC was struck down as constitutionally invalid. Remember, even in United States of America, never ever the American Supreme Court so far did not strike down even one constitutional amendment act. Their American Supreme Court is exercising some kind of restraint. So what is good in the interest of the Americans decided by the American Parliament and the American states in the form of amendment was permitted. American Supreme Court did not sit in the wisdom of the Parliament and the American states in making amendments to the American Constitution. So in the last more than 220 years, American Constitution was amended around 25 to 26 times. Not even one amendment was struck down by the American Supreme Court. That doesn't mean that the American Supreme Court doesn't have that power to strike it down. It has the power. The American Supreme Court can extend its power of judicial review not only with respect to ordinary laws, even with respect to constitutional amendment acts. But it has not done that. It is a sense of responsibility. In India, the Indian Supreme Court can strike down not only the ordinary laws passed through simple majority, even the constitutional amendment acts can be struck down. So here it was criticized that Supreme Court doesn't behave with a sense of responsibility. There are people like Pratap Bhanu Mehta who have written articles about Indian judiciary, the rise of judicial sovereignty. In any democracy, the supreme political power resides with the people and it is transferred to the elected representatives. So the final supreme political power must be in the hands of the politicians. But in India, we are witnessing a situation where the judiciary has become very powerful institution. This is one part of your discussion. The second one, judiciary versus executive. Even the powers of the executive branch were also cut down by the Indian Supreme Court through its power of interpretation. Any example? Any specific example? Collegium. In the original Indian Constitution, if you take Article 124, Article 124 deals with the appointment of the judge of the Supreme Court, judges of the Supreme Court. Article 124 says, a judge of Supreme Court shall be appointed by the President of India. President of India means Union government. India being a parliamentary democracy, the President doesn't take a decision on his individual judgment. He acts on the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers. So a judge of Supreme Court shall be appointed by the President of India means he will be appointed by the Union government by consulting the Chief Justice of India and such other judges of the Supreme Court and High Court. So Article 124 says, judges of the Supreme Court shall be appointed by the Union government, which is the executive branch, by consulting the judicial branch. So if both agree, the appointment can be made, which means in appointing the judges of the Supreme Court, executive branch and the judicial branch, they have equal role. Article 217. A judge of High Court shall be appointed by the President of India by consulting the Chief Justice of India, Governor of the concerned state, and such of the judges of the High Court and Supreme Court. This is what Article 217 says. So even here, while appointing a judge of Supreme Court, there will be a consultation between executive branch and the judicial branch. That is the President of India and the judicial branch. If both agree, the appointments are made. Similarly, Article 222 Clause 1. Transfer of a judge from one High Court to another High Court. So a judge can be transferred from one High Court to another High Court by the President of India consulting the Chief Justice of India. Here again the transfer must be done by the consultation between executive and judiciary. If both agree, transfer can be done. So this is what is provided for in the original Indian Constitution. Equal role, balanced role for the executive and judiciary in making appointments to the higher judiciary and in transferring the judges from one high court to another high court. But what the Supreme Court has done in 1998, not in 1998, in 1993, there was one case called Scora versus Union of India, 1993. Scora means Supreme Court Advocates on Record Association. Simply put, they are the practicing advocates in the Indian Supreme Court. The association of the practicing advocates in the Indian Supreme Court. They have filed a case before the Supreme Court. So here we must discuss 3 cases, otherwise you will get confused. 1. SP Gupta. SP Gupta versus Union of India, 1982. This is one case. Scora versus Union of India, 1993. Then presidential reference case. Presidential reference case. This was in 1998. So from 1950 up to 1982, the position is, while appointing the judges of the Supreme Court and High Court, executive and judiciary has equal role. Both shall agree. If one of them disagrees, such appointment shall not be made. So there was this balance from 1950 to 1982. This balance has gone in 1982. The case is SP Gupta versus Union of India, 1982. In this case was decided by a 7-judge bench. In this case, the Supreme Court said, while appointing a judge of Supreme Court, while appointing a judge of High Court, while transferring a judge from one High Court to another High Court, there shall be consultation between the executive and judiciary. If there is a disagreement, the opinion of the executive is final and binding. Why shall it be final and binding? The reason given by the Supreme Court is, executive is accountable to the people. Executive is elected for a term of 5 years. Every 5 years it goes before the electorate. There is no such accountability on the part of the judiciary. So, the final veto must be with the executive branch. So, while appointing a judge of Supreme Court and High Court, while transferring a judge from one High Court to another High Court, the President of India must consult the judicial branch. After making consultation, if there is disagreement between the executive branch and the judicial branch, the opinion of the executive branch is final and binding. The executive will have the veto power. So from 1982 to 1993, it was the domination of the executive in the transfers and the appointments. And this led to the executive interference in the working of the Indian judiciary. So subsequently, the practicing advocates in the Indian Supreme Court filed a case before the Supreme Court. The judgment in 1982 was not a balanced judgment. It must be reviewed. You know that the Indian Supreme Court has the power to review its own judgment. So in this case, 1993 case, Supreme Court has given an entirely different interpretation. Supreme Court Advocates and Record Association versus Union of India, 1993. This case was decided by a 9-judge bench, anonymously. All the judges with one voice. What is the judgment? While appointing the judges of the higher judiciary, while transferring a judge from one High Court to another High Court, there shall be consultation between executive and judiciary. If there is disagreement, the opinion of the judiciary is final and binding. So now again the balance gone in favor of the judiciary. Why the judiciary shall have the veto power? Because the supremacy of the Indian Constitution can be protected only by independent judiciary. And to protect the independence of judiciary, the judiciary must have primacy in making the appointments and transfers. So in this case, it is in the second, SP Gupta case is called first judge case. Scora versus Union of India is called the second judge case. And the presidential reference 1998 is the third judge case. And in the second judge case, the Supreme Court also coined the term collegium. Remember, the term collegium doesn't find a mention in the Indian Constitution. This was again an extra constitutional forum created by the Indian Supreme Court through its power of interpretation. What the Supreme Court said? While appointing the judges of the High Court and Supreme Court, while transferring a judge from one High Court to another High Court, the decision will be taken by the collegium. Collegium will have the final decision making power. Who will be there in the collegium? The Supreme Court in the second judge case said it will contain one Chief Justice of India and two senior most judges of the Supreme Court. There was no representation to the judges of the High Court. Keep that in mind. But Government of India is confused. What is this collegium? How many judges will be there in the collegium? So under Article 143 of the Indian Supreme Court, in 1998, Article 143, advisory jurisdiction of the Indian Supreme Court. The Union government can seek the opinion of the Indian Supreme Court through the President of India under Article 143. So the Union government asked the Indian Supreme Court, what do you mean by collegium? How many judges will be there in the collegium? We want a clarity. And the Supreme Court accordingly, in the third judge case or presidential reference case said that collegium contains not 3 judges. Collegium contains 5 judges. While appointing a judge of Supreme Court, while transferring a judge from one High Court to another High Court, collegium contains 5 judges. Chief Justice of India and 4 senior most judges of the Supreme Court. But while appointing a judge of High Court, collegium contains only 3 judges. Chief Justice of India and 2 senior most judges. So this is what the clarity given by the Supreme Court. This is the clarity given by the Supreme Court in the third judge case or presidential reference case. While appointing a judge of Supreme Court, while transferring a judge from one High Court to another High Court, collegium contains 5 judges. Chief Justice of India and 4 senior most judges. But while appointing a judge of High Court, collegium contains 3 judges, Chief Justice of India and 2 senior most judges. Then how the decisions will be taken? For example, while appointing a judge of Supreme Court, collegium contains 5. The Chief Justice of India says something, the other 4 judges disagree with the Chief Justice of India. Can the opinion of the Chief Justice of India can have veto? No. So in the third judge case, the Supreme Court said, in addition to the Chief Justice of India, out of the remaining 4, at least 3 must support the opinion of the Chief Justice of India. So out of 5, 4 must agree. If you want to appoint X as a judge of Supreme Court, Chief Justice of India must agree. In addition to the Chief Justice of India, you also need the support of 3 out of the remaining 4 senior most judges. Then only the appointment becomes valid. And in the third judge case, the Supreme Court also said, all the appointments recommended by the collegium may not be agreed by the President of India, Union government. Union government can reject, but if the same names were recommended for the second time, with or without changes, then second time it is binding on the Union government. It cannot say no. Once it can send for reconsideration of the collegium. If, for example, K.M. Joseph, he was recommended to be appointed as the judge of Supreme Court by collegium. Union government said no. It was referred back to collegium. Second time collegium said the same recommendation, he must be appointed. So once it goes for the second time to the Union government, the second time it cannot say no. So this is the third judge case. So here 2 cases are important. Keshwananda Bharati versus State of Kerala, the power of Indian Parliament to amend the Constitution is reduced. Then the second judge case, Supreme Court Advocates and Record Association versus Union of India. Now, who has the final say in appointing the judges of the High Court and Supreme Court? It is the collegium, which means the power of the executive branch to participate in making the appointments to higher judiciary is taken away by the Supreme Court by coining the term collegium in the second judge case. So earlier, before the second judge case, executive branch also had a voice in appointing the judges. Now, the executive has no role in appointing the judges of the Supreme Court and High Court. The final power is with the Supreme Court. Isn't that a case of reducing the powers of the executive branch? So these are the two cases which you must refer, minimum. In addition to that, you can add on some more cases. So there is one article, Article 142. So the Indian Supreme Court can pass orders for doing complete justice. The Indian Supreme Court can pass orders for doing complete justice. So under this article, the Supreme Court took up the role of the executive branch. The policy making role which is ideally given to the executive was taken up by the Supreme Court. And there are a number of cases where the Indian Supreme Court entered into the areas of the executive and legislature. Where the Indian Supreme Court entered into the areas of the executive and legislature, which we say judicial overreach. So those cases you can quote if you have time. If you don't have time, these two cases are enough. Keshavananda Bharati case, second judge case. Keshavananda Bharati case, judiciary versus legislature. Powers of legislature were reduced. Parliament reduced. Second judge case, judiciary versus executive. The powers of the executive were cut down by coining the term collegium. So use the word doctrine of basic structure, use the term collegium. So that will be your answer. That is what you have to write. So that's it about that question.